Hey everyone, welcome to another week of ProMAX Tech Talks. I'm here with the ProMAX team. I got Brian, Nathaniel, and Mike here, and this week we're going to be talking about how a video server can improve your overall post-production process. So guys, let's get started with one of the big topics here, centralized backup. What does that look like before you have a server in your workflow compared to afterwards? Like, what does that do for your team? How does that enable you to work with that? Nathaniel, do you want to kick that off? I know we've talked about this not too long ago, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's hard, if not impossible, to really properly do backup if you don't have a shared storage environment, because you just wind up with a lot of different types of storage spread out in different spots. It's just really hard to organize all of that. So, I've seen a lot of environments where it's like we've got a bunch of Thunderbolt RAIDs or USB drives. Invariably, you end up with a ton of stuff on the shelf, a ton of drives sitting on the shelf. And backups in those environments, they always kind of wind up of yeah, we copied some files over to this other drive, and that's kind of what we do. And it's never complete, and it's never really 100%, just because there's no like one point where you can manage that from. So once you move to a shared environment, that just fundamentally changes because you can say, okay, here's our pools of storage. Is this pool backed up? Is it not backed up? It's a lot easier to both track whether or not that's happened, as well as just tactically, like you have one point that you can back up from.
Yeah, I mean, think about like one fantastic analogy that I've heard is, I mean, think about running your business by giving everybody like a little bit of petty cash and trying to keep track of everything, as opposed to doing it from like a centralized bank account. Like it we're basically there with data, like everything is centralized and it should be. But I mean, the ability to monitor all that and actually understand the health of your business is a lot easier, when everything is under one interface, one umbrella. I mean, there's no way you could do it otherwise.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think that's especially unique with backup, though, because I've seen a lot of people kind of eke by on copying project files over and making local storage work, which is pretty simple. There's benefits to local storage, but I have, in literally 20 years of doing this, I can think of one customer that I ever talked to that had what I would consider a good backup strategy on local storage.
What did that look like?
He was just like picking his brain, like he was just super structured and methodical. And I don't remember, this is a conversation from like 4 years ago, but I still remember it. But like he managed it, I think through spreadsheets, but he had a very specific cadence of like every Friday I collect all of the hard drives, I put them all in this one system. I back them up through, I think he was using Carbon Copy Cloner. He said, I back them up on Carbon Copy Cloner to two drives. I put those, like, it was very like, and I dug in with him and he was actually doing it. And I totally believe him. But the 99.9% rest of people I've ever talked to, it's like, yeah, we sometimes do that. And, I think most of our stuff is backed up, maybe. That's the reality.
Okay. Brian, going through when you're taking customers through workflow training, do you see any common speed bumps that people encounter going from a non-centralized backup like system we're talking about to a centralized system, or is it typically something people are like, this is great, like just kind of jump right into it?
It's just a lot of mindset changes. Probably the biggest hurdle for a company that's making a transition from local storage to shared storage has to face is usually there's a lot of personal ownership of local stuff. So like you'll have like Mike's drive or Mike's folder or Nathaniel's drive, and inevitably when they get one of our systems and I start doing the workflow training, I'll look in there and we'll see platform spaces that'll be like Nathaniel and Mike and Matt and Brian, and that's just not like once you're in a shared storage environment, the idea is that your projects and your storage components are not necessarily universal, but they're not individual. Like the whole purpose is to kind of shake the individuality. Because if I need to get into Mike's project on a day that he's out, if he, gets into a car accident or something, then I don't know his, his folder structure. He may have a completely different project structure than I do. So standardizing that kind of stuff into a more universal environment is definitely, the hardest thing that a lot of the smaller companies go through. From a backup perspective, what they most of the time it's when we force the conversation about, hey, what are you doing for backup? It's like, well, we want to do this. It's always how it begins, which implies that they're not doing it at all, or at least reasonably in the first place. And that's not true 100%, but it's true a pretty good majority of the time. Yeah, it's just really getting out of the theoretical and just doing it, and having a shared storage system it makes it a lot easier when there's only one or a handful of points of contact that you kind of have to worry about.
Yeah, and I'll piggyback off of that. First, I'm a little offended that you put Mike in a car accident in that example. Mike, I hope you're doing well, Mike. Personal ownership is definitely an interesting kind of way to look at it, because I think just naturally, when you have, everybody kind of doing their own thing, kind of nobody's in charge. Like it dilutes responsibility in a lot of ways. And I mean, like I remember a while back, we went through at our own company here, like, because we had this realization of, well, everybody's got their own laptops, but like we're not backing up like the local files on those laptops. So like, and there was no kind of personal responsibility there. So we changed that. But it's funny, Brian, you just kills me that comment you said, which is so funny. Like, yeah, well, what we want to do, and like literally, I just pulled up this note. I printed this out. I was talking to a customer earlier today, and they had a cache system, and they said, we used cache. We never had good luck with that system. It was supposed to be plug and play and drag and drop, and neither really ever worked for us. And they go on from there. But like I've seen that so many times in environments where it's like, well, this was our plan. We're not really doing that. And I think a lot of times when I've run into that, it is because it's just kind of impossible if you don't have centralized storage to start with as the foundation.
All right, that was a lot of good stuff coming from you guys. Mike, you're dealing with support. Do you see common things that people come to you with when it comes to backup? Whether it's common questions they have, common things that they're trying to work through?
A lot of workflows of like how to back up, or when I ask them if they have a backup, and the thoughts of how a backup actually works versus like a RAID system, I should say.
Do you want to dive into that a little bit?
Where a RAID isn't really a backup; it's a backup of hardware per se, in case a drive fails, but it's not an actual backup of your data. So there's no real redundancy of like multiple copies of your data, being in different locations in case something were to fail. So there's a lot of misconceptions of what a backup really is. Just trying to find certain things with backups and trying to figure out their workflow and trying to just clarify really more than anything.
All right, awesome. Thanks, guys. Is there anything else that you think we really need to be talking about when it comes to backup, or should we start moving on to the next phase of the post-production process on this?
We might touch on this in the other stuff, but one thing that always comes up in my backup conversations with our customers is I think what people call backup generically can mean different things for different people. I usually put it into one of three buckets. One of those buckets is disaster recovery, and that's making sure that you have files backed up offsite. The other is what I just consider kind of generically protecting data. So that could be from, files getting deleted or a RAID failing or anything like that. And there's different strategies for backing up data locally than there are for disaster recoveries. and it's going to protect you from different things. And then last but not least, which is often actually what people are talking about, is uptime protection. So how you protect yourself from, or how you guarantee uptime versus how you back up data. There's like, a Venn diagram where some of the things cross over, but I do find it's interesting. A lot of times people say they want backup, but what they really want to do is make sure that no matter what happens, they can keep working on projects, which can include backup, but that's not always the best answer necessarily. But I think it's really, really important to kind of start with that foundation of like, which of these are you really trying to accomplish before you dive into like, here's how to do it.
Yeah, to Nathaniel's point, exactly. There's the difference between, I've always looked at it from, data integrity, and then you've got your hardware resiliency factor, which is kind of the uptime question, and then disaster recovery. And he's exactly right. Like, you have completely different plans for all of these things. And even within, the majority of kind of what we would work in is more of the data integrity side, where you are making backups to protect against any number of different situations. Like if somebody accidentally deletes a file that they need to get back, that's a really common example that happens all the time. But it's just as important that backup is still going to save you if somebody, if your whole server goes down, and as long as you have that backup, in a different place, you're in good shape. So yeah, it just depends on your needs. And it also depends, the other conversation I get into a lot is, what are the backup tolerances that go along with that? Because everybody's tolerance is different to potential failure. Some companies, you can't be down for more than, an hour. You can't be down for more than 5 minutes in some cases, or at all. And other companies, you can, reliably say, or realistically say, hey, if we had to rewind 2 days, we're okay. Like, it's going to be an awful day, but we can survive that. And the difference there is budget and time. Certainly not everybody can afford 100% uptime type situations. It can generally be done, but you're gonna pay for it. So yeah, the tolerance factor is a big one, because it very much is it's a self-discovery conversation, and it's sometimes a painful admission of what you can and can't really bring to bear at the problem at hand. Again, not everybody has an unlimited budget, so sometimes you have to make the unfortunate decision about what your tolerance really is, and understand that and work to it.
You can get a little bit scrappy with that too, though, these days. Like,
Oh yeah.
One thing that that customer I referred to earlier, one thing I suggested for them, because they didn't need like a ton of storage, they need like 64 terabytes, like that's like a flash drive anymore. But uptime and backup was really important to them. And what I'm recommending for them is to get a 8-bay Thunderbolt RAID and load it up with cheap 8 terabyte hard drives. It's not, no money. It's $5,000, but you can then set up a real-time mirror. And I'll tell you, 3-4 years ago, you couldn't even talk about that kind of thing unless you were spending like an extra 20-30 grand. And it's pretty reasonable, I feel like, for customers more and more these days to say, you know what, yeah, $5,000 and we'll have everything replicated. And I personally like, I kind of like that type of mirroring to local storage, because it's a little down and dirty, but like if you ever do need to fail over to that, like it's a local drive that you can unplug from a server, plug into a workstation, and grab your stuff to actually work if you need to.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, if there's any one thing that a company that's making the transition from local storage to shared storage has, it's a bunch of external drives.
Sure. Yeah.
So, I've set up a ton of companies with even like a small USB 3 drive, a couple terabytes. You can, all backup programs notwithstanding, like most of them, you can target specific files. Like our system, you can target specific files. you can just send, one of the most common ones now is we just send over like the NLE project files, the stuff that's changing every day. That's like maybe, if you really dial down to it, the changes that are happening every day across a small to medium sized company is probably like 200 megabytes. It's tiny.
Yeah.
For those types of files, but those are where you're spending your time every minute of every day. So having that backed up, in near real time on a little 2 terabyte drive is great. Like, why not have that other backup just running, even though it's small and easy? Like, it's a scrappy solution, like you said.
All right, thanks, guys. So let's move into storage capacity. Obviously, if you're buying a server, you're going to be putting more drives into your system. You're going to expand your storage capacity. Besides the obvious that you can fit more stuff on there, what is storage capacity going to, like, more storage capacity going to do for a video team? Brian, you want to start us off?
um, Generally, it makes them more disorganized because they just save everything and don't delete anything. If there's anything that I've learned in the storage industry over the last, decade or so, it's no matter how big hard drives get, we will figure out how to fill them just as fast. Be it new cameras, be it just, the inherent anxiety with deleting anything. I mean, we've talked about that before in other venues, the digital hoarding situation that's in most people's heads. Like, I mean, nothing is removed, and it can fill stuff up super fast. We're gonna see 18 and 20 terabyte drives here pretty quick. We're moving 16 terabyte drives on a daily basis at this point. And it's a ridiculous amount of space that's available, but people fill it just the same and just as fast.
I think the cool thing is, and I'm gonna, shamelessly self-promote, ProMAX here. But I think it's important, this actually, storage capacity used to be kind of a downside of going towards shared storage, because ProMax and a lot of other vendors, traditionally, a lot of the margin was made around like, charging a lot for hard drives. And we kind of abandoned that and kind of did a mindset shift of like, no, like our clients, they should have like stupid amounts of storage. So all that really means is, kind of charging, reasonable prices for storage, which we do now. And the cool thing about that is, in a shared environment, when you add another, 100 terabytes, that goes to everybody. Versus, in a local environment, you add 100 terabytes and, this gal gets 10 terabytes, this guy gets 10 terabytes, this guy gets 10 terabytes. And that means it's just kind of all spread out everywhere and everybody gets a little benefit. Versus, with us and how we spec these systems out now, like it's just terabytes are just like everybody's got stupid amounts of it, which is just great. That's how it should be.
Beautiful. But so besides that, there's no real here's a performance boost or anything that comes with that. But except maybe let's talk about SSDs versus standard hard drives. That's where we see a performance boost if you make that change.
Yeah, I mean, performance wise, I'll tell you, in general, local storage usually will perform better because you only have one person hitting it. So, you've got, as example, you've got a 12-bay Thunderbolt RAID, and on a single workstation, you might be able to push 2,000 megs a second to that one RAID. Well, you connect that same RAID up in a shared environment, and you're slicing that performance between several different people. If those drives are spinning disk on top of that, now you've got those physical arms inside of the drives jumping across physical drives for multiple people at the same time. And now that 2,000 megs a second to one user gets spread out over 4 users. Kind of simple math, it doesn't work exactly like this, but let's say they each have 500 megs a second, but then they're all hitting at the same time, and suddenly, you're each getting 200 megs a second. So it kind of exponentially worsens performance with in a shared environment. SSDs are really the answer there. Like they don't have the same physical elements that spinning disks have. But you're still sharing a pool of performance across multiple users versus local storage where it's just always dedicated to that one user. So it's generally like just pure performance wise, you're going to be better in a local environment.
All right, awesome. So we'll take it to the next step. And obviously with when you're buying a server, you're gonna have like you're gonna have your processor, your GPU, all these different elements in there. Do those provide a performance boost? How does that improve? Does that improve anything? Is that going to help your team?
Well, just to kind of adjust your question a tiny bit, like in most cases, even in the shared storage world, in most cases, you're not talking about GPUs. You're not talking about server performance as really the driver for a purchase. Like in most, I'm generalizing, but when you look at a file server, generally it's one of their goals in most cases is to have just enough resources to do a file share and manage that properly, and that's it. We operate a little bit different, to Nathaniel's shameless self-promotion. Like we have different functions that happen on our systems that transcend, general shared storage when it comes to transcode and asset management and stuff. So we have uses for those other resources. But in general, it's, when you're looking at basic file servers, it's a pretty straight shot to storage performance, and that's it. That's all they really care about. And it's mostly all you'll really find performance specs on in most cases. So, but to the question of what do you look for in that, obviously it's the primary thing is storage performance. Most people are not shopping for a transcode server. They're not going to sidestep into a transcode system that also has 100 terabytes of shared storage. Like that's it's a pretty large jump. That said, if you need 100 terabytes of shared storage and there's other functionality that you can benefit from that potentially can be added to that, then that's a different story. But most people, they're coming for capacity, usually 99% of the time. Well, no, like I don't know. Nathaniel could probably put a number to this, but the vast majority of the time they're coming to expand capacity, and a close second is to expand performance for new workflows.
Yeah, I mean, performance and capacity are the yin and the yang of our our world. I do think it's notable, all systems kind of have their own nuances and the things that matter to them, and how they process data, like how the software was written impacts how data is processed on these systems. So like Matt, you bring up GPU. For our clients, GPU is phenomenal for proxy workflows because we can offload proxy generation to a GPU. So we actually, we do GPUs in a lot of our systems because of that, because that will increase performance of the server and will overall make your workflow a lot better. That said, there's other, I don't know specifically, but I'm sure there are other competitors of ours that don't offload to GPU. So if you put a GPU in there, it doesn't matter. Like it's like that only matters if the software is going to take advantage of it. Another example, I was talking to somebody yesterday who was actually surprised at how little RAM we put into our systems. And my comment to them was, well, with the software setup on this, you're not going to utilize more RAM than this. Like these are giant video files that you're streaming. Like they're not going to RAM and buffering in there. Like, they weren't utilizing After Effects rendering Cinema 4D stuff on the server. So, you kind of have to look at, each system kind of has its own, uniqueness to what hardware it will take advantage of and what will improve performance. And then you have to kind of weigh that against like how you're using it, and balance the system in the right way. Like it always cracks me up when I see people get really obsessed with like we got to have as much RAM, and it's like, well, at least in our system that's certainly not true. Like how we utilize processing.
Okay, so after hearing you guys talk a little bit and specifically how you responded, Brian, I kind of want to rephrase the question that I originally started with. So obviously when you go to any vendor, any shared storage vendor's website, we all pound our chest for our read and write speeds. Why do those matter, and what's the difference between the maximum and the sustained ones?
I just love the visual of like, let's beat our chests on.
I mean, without getting specific, like you can cherry pick numbers to make them whatever you want. And when you get into the world of shared storage speed, obviously higher is better, but the kind of underlying component, is sustainability of those speeds. Like you can cache, and there are, I mean, if you've seen these little M2 drives that everybody uses in the in operating system drives and stuff now, and NVMe flash and stuff, these things, a $60 deal, 250 gigs runs at 2,500 megabytes a second. I mean, it's ridiculous. And you can use something like that as a cache and move for a small period of time at 2,500 megabytes a second. But then the system has to flush that to the drives, and eventually you are going to bottleneck on your real speeds. And the problem with sustained versus burst kind of performance, if you're not working off of the sustained performance, then at some point, whether you like it or not, you will be. And if you've got a few users, that might not be a big deal. You might benefit a lot from a small cache. It might work great. If you've got more than a few users, it's going to come and go depending on who's doing what. The speeds are going to be pretty variable. And if you've got a lot, even if you have a few users, if you have a lot of data, big files, you're working at 5, 6K or something like that, you go through cache fast. So there's a lot of different stuff to keep in mind on that. But when it comes to video stuff, like we really want to focus on sustained performance because we just don't know how much data is going to be coming and going. We're not a database workflow where they can look at a graph after a week and be like, hey, we're going to move, 2,047 gigabytes today. Like we just know that it's going to be about that and make a workflow for that. Like we don't have that level of predictability in our stuff. So we don't know exactly, how beneficial caching will be. It is beneficial, but it's not something that you can really rely on for the long term when it comes to performance. So we always default to sustained performance because that's what we can depend on. That's what the client can depend on. Yeah.
Well, we spec out both on our website. And it is interesting. I was pointing this out to somebody yesterday. When you look at kind of that max or burst performance, Brian, and you compare SSDs to standard hard drives, the performance really isn't that different. Where we see real differences in the sustained performance. So, you compare SSDs and standard hard drives in a burst environment, and, SSDs might be 20% faster. Like, that's cool, but that's not game changing. But once you get past those bursts, that max performance and get into long term, that's when SSDs are, 3-4x plus the performance. And it's confusing, right? Like you've got, I'll give a real example here, an enterprise class 12G SAS drive, which is kind of the standard in our world. Individually, those are going to push about 250 megs a second. I'm going to say that it's usually a little more than that, but I'll say that to make the math easy. You get a 16 bay, which is pretty common. You multiply 16 drives by 250, and that's 4,000. Like that's just kind of the math on it, right? So, okay, so you got 4,000 megs a second to work with, right? Well, no, you RAID that up and then you run a benchmark test on it. And, to your point, Brian, you can kind of game it. Like you can change how many K, like what size of files
block
are we
size, file time.
There's so many ways you can game that. And, you might be able to show a burst performance of, I'll call it 2,800 megs a second. And this is where I see a lot of times newer vendors will do those benchmarks and be like, oh my God, like, and they'll throw that on their website. And we can do that. Like that's that 4,000 megs a second, you add it up, that's correct. We can get a benchmark of 2,800 megs a second. We can do that. We spec out 16 12G SAS drives at 1,200 megs a second sustained performance, which looks like pretty crappy performance compared to the benchmark burst. But that's just the reality of when you have people start, once you push outside of the cache of the RAID controller or the NVMe drives in a system, and once you start really long-term using the system, that's when you'll actually see 1,200 megs a second. So it's definitely important to understand those concepts in a shared environment.
Awesome. Did you have something about to say, Brian?
He was throwing around numbers and my internal OCD was screaming, but I'm going to restrain myself. The point stands.
Okay, I couldn't tell if you were about to get started on something.
It's about the concept, not exactly.
The concept is sound.
All right. So obviously, if someone's looking for a shared storage server, they got to have someone to share it with. So why does some purchasing one of these servers, how does that enable integration and collaboration for a video team? Nathaniel? Brian?
We were both waiting on each.
You almost made it, Matt. You almost made it without me saying it depends on your workflow.
Oh, I
was literally like just hoping that we would get through it. No, but seriously, it really does depend on your workflow because everybody works differently in this regard, right? Like we have clients that honestly, one of the biggest benefits to shared storage for them is just the ability to centralize the organization. They're less thrilled about the fact that they bought 100 terabytes and more thrilled that it's one thing that everybody can see that's universal and there's not multiple versions of stuff floating around anymore. So it could just be a factor of keeping everything in one place. There's other clients that will have multiple people touch the same project, and when you have a scenario like that, it's insanely valuable because then you just go to the other directory, open up the project, or you enable Adobe sharing, stuff like that, Media Composer, bin locking, any of those things to do like the really crazy collaborative workflows where people are in the same projects. There's a ton of different ways to collaborate on that stuff. Probably one of the biggest ways though is when you get not just multiple editors working together, but multiple facets of production working together. You've got ingest that's bringing in and they're putting footage literally right into the project folder. You've got graphic artists who are working and they're dropping new graphics, new lower thirds, new bumpers, whatever, right in the project folder. And in the editor, everything's in one place and they're going, and it's just all having a bunch of departments being able to work on the same project through different, bringing in data through different vectors, all landing in the same place. For this one, the editor is kind of the guy that puts all the pieces together at the end. So having that all set, and again, from a backup perspective too, super convenient because you can grab that whole project and send that off, and you're not, running around getting Dave's drive and Mike's drive and Matt's drive and, trying to make sure you've got all the pieces before you throw it on a shelf somewhere. Yeah, it's very variable. But in almost every case, though, if you're in an environment where more than one person is working on the project, it's going to have some benefit for you.
Well, and I'll also throw a little bit on MAM in there too, which can go beyond just the collaboration experience. And I've seen quite a few of our customers and quite a few customers over time utilize MAM and central storage to allow people outside of the video department be able to search and find things, which can be really, really helpful for the creative team, for the video team.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right, and then let's talk about flexibility. Does a server like this allow your team to be a little more flexible with your workflow, to be able to do some things they may not have been able to do in a local environment?
I mean, I don't think there's like any particular workflow that you can't do in a local environment that you can do in a shared environment. It's just the speed at which you can do that, I think, more than can you do it. The speed and the simplicity, if you're actually trying to have multiple people work on the same project at the same time with different elements, it's a pretty complex, ugly workflow to try to make that happen. So yeah, in that environment, it's still not impossible. It's just onerous and ugly.
Okay. Even if we're talking with like having remote employees or having freelancers and contractors in the mix, is there any change to that?
Brian, you might know better than I do. I don't think that really factors in because we're still not at a point in technology where it's just as simple as like, oh, connect, from home and edit. So like it's
Yeah,
you're still using a Dropbox or something to kind of manage that.
there's a
Okay.
there's a hand there's a handful of users, that benefit from being able to lock permissions down for interns or for freelancers and stuff, as you bring in contract workers and such, where you don't necessarily have to give them keys to the castle, like, hey, here's this here, we'll plug you into our server and you can see everything. By the way, don't look in the folder that's labeled financials. So there's stuff like that. You could just very, very cleanly kind of segment stuff off. And virtually all the systems that are out there will let you do that in some way, shape, or form, some more intuitively than others. But um, that's really a big factor. I wouldn't say it's a defining factor though. Like I will say the vast majority of the people that we work with, eh, everything's open. Like permissions are actually a speed bump that they don't want to deal with in most cases. Once you reach a certain point, a company kind of flips a switch and all of a sudden that really matters because then you're kind of in you're big enough to be a legal entity and such like that. And it gets a little weird fast, but yeah, I don't think it really to the root of the question, like if a shared storage server or does a shared storage server enable more flexibility in your workflow? Um, you know, Probably like outwardly, probably not. It actually makes your workflow a little more rigid in that it's one, you've got this one location to go. That said, if flexibility in your workflow is like ultimate flexibility in your workflow is really what you're looking for, like you can't really commit to one thing or another. Like you're just all over the place, which is, I guess, a strength into itself, but you have to have some level of organization in there somewhere. Um,
All right. Awesome. Makes sense. And then to wrap this up, last topic is scalability. Obviously, if you're a company, you want your company to grow. You want to bring in more projects, you want to bring in more work. How does a server bringing in some kind of shared storage server enable your company to grow either faster, more efficiently? What does that look like?
there's a pretty singular defining, well, one of the defining things that really stands out in shared storage servers that make some of them much better than others at scalability, and that is if the shared storage server that you're using has a kind of universal interface where if as you add new expansions and as you add new nodes, that they're all kind of brought under the same umbrella, that they're all managed through the same interface. Because some of the lower end systems, which are really cost effective, once you get into having multiple systems in place, then there's I got to log into this drive or this drive over here. And to make matters worse, they generally all look the same. So you're logging into system A or system B, and there's multiple shares inside of all of those, and it gets confusing pretty fast. So
Yeah, and I'll piggyback off of that because, and I say nothing bad about these products, but I've seen us replace quite a few QNAPs and Synologies. Those are kind of the some really good systems that are great kind of entries into shared environments.
mhm.
But we've replaced those where they did start adding and scaling to, two or
Yeah.
three systems. And then suddenly it's almost like when you don't have, Brian, what you're talking about with like a single login, single management, what you wind up having is kind of a shared environment with a lot of the like local issues that you used to run into with local
Yeah.
storage, where it's like, oh, we've got this project is on this volume, not that one. We're copying it over here. You get into a lot of those same kind of issues, which is why we've gone in and replaced some of those. That said, from a scalability standpoint, I think another one that's really important from scaling is the ability to centralized storage does give you the ability to bring in freelancers very quickly and very easily. That factors in permissions, like you were talking about, Brian. You've got a freelancer that comes in, you don't want to give them the keys to the kingdom. So being able to control what they see is really important. And being able to have somebody come in, like literally, like nowadays with the everything pretty much being NAS based, it's so super easy and so super cool of like somebody can come in with their own MacBook Pro, connect up to the house network, and like they're online on your central storage system in 5 minutes, like, and it's and then suddenly they've got access to the storage pool that they need access to. And that's pretty appealing for a lot of our customers that like do have, hey, we've got a big project and we brought in a few extra people.
Awesome. Anything else on scalability to close this out? I think there was a lot of good information coming from everyone and all that. All right, doesn't sound like it. All right, well, thanks guys. Thanks everyone for joining us for another week of ProMAX Tech Talks. If you have any questions you want to answer on a future episode, leave them in the comments below. If you're not already, follow our social media channels, and if you're not already, hit that red subscribe button below to start following our channel and get some more video production tips. All right, everyone, thanks for joining us and have a great day.